Goldfield didn't die in 1898. It transformed. 11 people documented what they found there. A photographer capturing murders before they happened. A piano playing itself, voices still trapped in a water tank, shadows that didn't exist. These accounts slipped through official records for a reason. Subscribe to Verified Souls. The first thing you notice about gold is that it's heavier than you expect. I learned that in my first week at Goldfield, March 1894, when Mr. Edmund Thorne handed me a 2-ounce sample and watched my wrist drop with the weight of it. I was 22, one of 3 women working in technical roles in the entire town, and Mr. Thorne had hired me specifically because my father was an assayer in Philadelphia. "You won't faint at the chemicals," he'd said during the interview, as if that was the only qualification that mattered. He was right about that, at least. I didn't faint. I should have. The assay office sat on Main Street, wedged between the saloon and the general store, a narrow brick building that stayed perpetually cool despite the Arizona heat. Inside, everything smelled of nitric acid and my own competence. We tested ore samples for miners, calculated percentages, issued certificates that determined whether a man's claim was worth pursuing or abandoning. It was precise work, mathematical, the kind of work that didn't leave room for intuition or doubt, only numbers, and numbers didn't lie. Mr. Thorne kept the scales on the main counter, a beautiful brass instrument with delicate calibration marks and a polished wooden base. The beam was steady, the pans perfectly balanced. I'd used scales like it dozens of times. You placed the sample on one side, added weights to the other until equilibrium was achieved, and recorded the result. Simple, reproducible, reliable. It started on a Tuesday in late March. I was alone in the office. Mr. Thorne had stepped out to meet with a miner about a disputed claim when I noticed the scales had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that the left pan sat marginally lower than the right, despite being empty. I adjusted the beam, recalibrated, and thought nothing of it. Metal settles. Buildings shift in temperature. There were explanations. But it happened again the next day. And the day after that. By Friday, I mentioned it to Mr. Thorne. He examined the scales with the expression of someone inspecting evidence of betrayal, running his fingers along the brass, checking every component. "These are precise instruments," he said finally. "Perhaps you're not reading them correctly." I said nothing. I'd been reading scales correctly since I was 14. The real strangeness began the following week. I arrived one morning to find the scales positioned differently than I'd left them. The left pan wasn't just slightly lower. It was depressed with genuine weight, though nothing sat upon it. No visible object, no dust, no explanation. I lifted the pan carefully. It was warm. Not hot, but warm, as if something had been resting there for hours. I didn't tell Mr. Thorne. Instead, I started keeping records. Not official assay records. Personal notes in a ledger I kept hidden beneath the counter. Date, time, position of the scales, weight displacement, any visible changes. I began to notice patterns. The scales always shifted when Mr. Thorne was meeting with a specific group of miners. The Brennan brothers, a man named Kellerman, who owned claims adjacent to the richest deposits, and occasionally a surveyor named Hutchins. 4 men. They'd come in with ore samples that Mr. Thorne would personally assay while I was sent to inventory supplies in the back room. One afternoon in April, I deliberately lingered near the window overlooking the street. Mr. Thorne and the Brennan brothers stood in heated conversation outside the office. I couldn't hear their words, but I saw Mr. Thorne's hand press something into Kellerman's palm, a document folded twice. The body language was wrong for legitimate business. It was the posture of transaction, of something being concealed. That evening, after Mr. Thorne left, I checked the scales again. The left pan sagged with the impression of weight. I placed my hand on it, and the brass was so warm it almost burned. I pulled my hand away and wrote in my hidden ledger, April 18th, scales warm, impression approximately 147 grains. Over the next 3 weeks, it happened repeatedly. Always 147 grains. Always with Mr. Thorne's meetings with those same 4 men. Always leaving a residue of warmth that took hours to dissipate. The real terror came when I began cross-referencing the dates. Goldfield had a habit of losing people. Men disappeared, claiming new strikes in remote areas, or simply moved on to the next boom. But 4 men from surrounding claims had vanished in the past 8 months. James Brennan, his brother Michael, a surveyor named Hutchins, and a claim jumper named Kellerman. All gone. All without proper explanation. All connected to Mr. Thorne. I went to the town's records office and examined claim deeds. The pattern was unmistakable. Whenever one of those 4 men disappeared, their claims transferred to Mr. Thorne within weeks. Not through normal channels. These were rush transfers, notarized by the same clerk, often with vague notation about voluntary relinquishment or sale for undisclosed consideration. The clerk's signature was the same man who prepared every document, a man I'd seen sitting in Mr. Thorne's office one evening, receiving a stack of bills that looked substantially thicker than a legitimate fee. By May, I was terrified, not of the scales, of what they were telling me. Those 147 grains of phantom weight returned again, and each time it corresponded to claim deeds. Each time, I mapped the timeline and found disappearances. 4 men, 147 grains, repeated 4 times. It wasn't coincidence, it was documentation. The scales were keeping a record. I stopped eating properly. My hand shook when Mr. Thorne stood near me. I considered leaving Goldfield entirely, but I had no money, no family to return to, and the nearest town was 30 miles away. I was trapped in an office with a man I suspected of murder, watched over by scales that weighed invisible evidence. One morning in late May, I arrived to find all 3 men waiting, Mr. Thorne, the corrupt clerk, and the mining commissioner. My stomach dropped. They'd discovered I'd been examining claim deeds. They knew. Mr. Thorne smiled, a smile that looked like a skull in human skin. "Miss Catherine, we need to discuss your future with our operation." His hand moved to a drawer beneath the counter, toward the scales. He lifted them. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, were 4 items. A surveyor's compass with initials scratched inside, a gold wedding band, a portion of a torn claim deed, and a leather notebook containing someone's handwriting. "Evidence," he said quietly. "The problem with scales is they're so precise, so specific. Someone very clever hid these items beneath the pan, hoping that the weight impression would be recorded, analyzed, reconstructed. Someone who thought supernatural phenomena would convince an investigator of foul play. He was looking at me now with absolute certainty. But you know better, don't you? You know there's no such thing as invisible weight, no such thing as phantom warmth. You know these objects were placed here, and you know by whom. The only question is whether you're going to be smart about what happens next." I understood then. He'd orchestrated everything. He'd hidden evidence beneath the scales knowing I would find it, knowing I would notice the pattern, knowing I would be driven mad by the impossible explanation before accepting the real one. He'd wanted me to see those claim deeds, to understand his method, to become complicit through knowledge. The scales had never been haunted. They'd been a test of my loyalty. "You're going to forget what you've seen," he said. "You're going to continue working here, assaying ore, keeping your mouth closed. Because if you don't, those items will be found in your possession. The notebook is in your handwriting now. I've been practicing for weeks. Your fingerprints are already on the compass and the ring. Who do you think the town will believe? The assayer's assistant, or 3 established men of business?" I stayed in Goldfield for 3 more months. I processed ore samples, watched Mr. Thorne meet with those same men, and said nothing. I left in August with what money I'd saved, knowing I'd witnessed the perfect crime wrapped in the disguise of the impossible. The scales are still in that office, or whatever remains of it now. But sometimes I wonder if they ever actually moved at all, or if I imagined the whole thing because the truth was too unbearable to accept, that evil doesn't announce itself with supernatural phenomena. It whispers through precise, mathematical transactions. It hides in plain sight, balanced perfectly until nobody questions the weight. What do you think happened to those 4 men? Did anyone ever discover the truth, or does Goldfield still keep their secrets? Tell me in the comments. My name is Klaus Hoffman, and I have spent 45 years perfecting the craft of fermentation. I came to Goldfield in 1896 because I heard there was gold in the ground, but what I found instead was something far stranger fermenting in the dark. This testimony is given to Dr. Marcus Webb on the 16th of September, 1897, 3 days before I am committed to the Arizona Territorial Asylum. I offer it not as explanation, but as documentation. Someone should know what I experienced, even if they choose to believe me mad. The brewery was my pride. I had built it from nothing, hauled materials from Phoenix, constructed the fermentation cellar myself in the limestone foundation beneath Main Street. The underground chambers stayed at the perfect temperature naturally, cool and stable, exactly what German brewing demands. I had contracts with every saloon in Goldfield. My beer was good. My beer was reliable. My beer was the only thing that made sense in a town built on the lie that gold would last forever. The fermentation process is not mysterious, though many treat it as magic. Yeast consumes sugar, produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, transforms simple ingredients into something complex and intoxicating. I understood every stage. I controlled every variable: temperature, humidity, pH balance, ingredient purity. I measured everything. I wrote everything down. There were no surprises in fermentation, only science. The first batch that went wrong was in March. I had prepared the wort precisely. Barley malt sourced from my supplier in Milwaukee. Hops from the same fields I had used for 20 years. Water drawn from the well and boiled to exact specifications. I pitched the yeast at optimal temperature, sealed the tanks, and waited for the familiar progression: lag phase, exponential growth, attenuation, final rest. Simple, reproducible, perfect. 3 days into fermentation, I noticed the smell. It was not the smell of fermentation gone bad. I knew that smell intimately: vinegar, acetone, the sharp reek of bacterial contamination. This was different. Organic, yes, but wrong in a way I could not identify. It was the smell of something alive that should not be alive. I opened the tank despite protocol, despite the risk of oxidation, and found nothing visibly wrong. The wort was still clear, the yeast was working, but the smell persisted, growing stronger each day. When I tasted the finished beer, a cardinal sin, but necessary for diagnosis, it tasted normal. Exactly normal. Perfect even. Better than perfect. It tasted like comfort. Like home. Like forgetting why you had left Milwaukee in the first place. I drank 3 glasses that night. I dreamed of my daughter, whom I had not seen in 12 years. She had written to me that she was marrying a man I did not approve of, a banker with soft hands who had never worked. I had told her she was a fool. I had told her I would not attend the wedding. She had written back that she would not expect me. The last letter I received from her was in 1890. After that, nothing. That night, drinking my strange new beer, I dreamed she came to find me. She showed me her children, my grandchildren, and they looked at me with eyes full of accusation. When I woke, my face was wet. I told myself it was sweat. The next batch manifested the same problem, and the next. Each time the fermentation process looked normal, tested normal, but produced something that tasted like revelation. After drinking even a small glass, people reported vivid memories they had tried to forget. My employees noticed their hands shaking as they worked. The saloon keepers mentioned that customers were ordering less. 1 glass of my beer was enough to send a man into his own head for hours. In May, I committed an act of deliberate destruction. I poured 3 full tanks down the drain. Thousands of dollars worth of product wasted. But I was terrified. Something in the fermentation process was changing. Something was being produced that should not exist. I sent samples to a chemist in Phoenix. He found nothing unusual. He found alcohol, sugars, proteins, yeast cells in various stages of death and dissolution, exactly what beer should contain. He wrote back questioning whether I was experiencing delusions. He suggested I might be consuming too much of my own product. But I was not delusional. I was observant. I began documenting what I noticed. The batches that produced the strange smell all fermented at precisely 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The ones that didn't go wrong fermented at 66 or 70. Something was thriving at 68 degrees that did not thrive at other temperatures. Something that existed in the space between perfect and imperfect. I started conducting experiments. I used boiled water instead of well water. Still smelled wrong. I changed suppliers for the malt. Still smelled wrong. I used different yeast strains. Still smelled wrong. I sterilized the tanks with vinegar and heat. Still smelled wrong. Nothing worked. The contamination persisted, adapting, as if it was alive and intelligent and waiting. In July, I brought in a consultant from Tucson, a man named Berkeley who claimed expertise in bacterial contamination. I showed him everything. He examined my notes, tasted the beer, ran his own tests. After 3 days, he pulled me aside in the cellar, away from my workers. "There is nothing wrong with your beer," he said. "Chemically, it is perfect. But something about it is making men depressed, melancholic. The saloon keepers say people drink 1 glass and spend hours remembering painful things. Regrets, lost loves, failed decisions. Mr. Hoffman, I think your beer is somehow extracting regret from the people who drink it." I thought he was insane. I told him so. He packed his things and left Goldfield the next morning. By August, I could no longer deny what was happening. People were becoming addicted to my beer specifically because of its effect. They came to the saloons, not for enjoyment, but for the strange communion with their own failures. They would drink and weep and speak about things they had buried decades ago. One man, a banker named Kelton, drank 2 glasses and then walked into the desert. They found him 3 days later, dehydrated and delirious, muttering about a daughter he had abandoned in San Francisco. That is when I understood. My brewery was not contaminated. It was a vessel. Something was using the fermentation process. Something was feeding on human regret and translating that into flavor, into chemical composition, into something that made men seek out their own pain. The warmer temperature, 68 degrees, that was the optimal environment for something to grow that existed partially in the biological world and partially in something else. Something I had no language for. I began refusing shipments. I told the saloon keepers my brewery was closing. I sealed the tanks and stopped fermentation entirely. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The cellar was silent. My workers asked why I was wasting perfectly good equipment. I paid them not to ask questions. Then I noticed condensation forming inside the sealed tanks despite the cool temperature of the cellar. Droplets collecting inside glass impossible to access. And the smell, that strange, alive smell, began seeping through the seals. It was breeding. It was proliferating. It did not need me to feed it anymore. I came to this asylum voluntarily. I told the doctors I could not continue in Goldfield. I told them I was experiencing delusions brought on by isolation and work stress. They believed that explanation because it was easier than believing what I actually knew, that somewhere in the limestone cellar beneath Main Street, something is still fermenting at precisely 68 degrees. It is still converting human pain into consumable form. It is still waiting for someone foolish enough to unseal those tanks and taste what it has become. Dr. Webb, I am not mad. I am simply a man who learned too late that some processes should not be perfected. Some transformations should not be allowed to complete. If you go to Goldfield and smell something organic rising from beneath the ground, do not investigate. Do not open the tanks. Let it ferment. Let it finish whatever it is becoming. Some things are not meant to be understood. Do you believe fermentation can produce something impossible? Or is Klaus a victim of his own obsession? Share your theory in the comments. You start driving the Goldfield Ghost Town Railroad in February 2019, fresh out of a teaching career that has burned you out completely. 34 years old, divorced, and desperately needing something that feels real again. The narrow-gauge train that loops through the historic site seems perfect. A job where you can help people experience history, where the script is predetermined and nothing unexpected will happen. You are wrong about that last part. You've kept meticulous records of every third Thursday for 9 months because you need evidence of what you're experiencing, not for anyone else to believe. You stopped expecting that months ago, but for yourself, for proof that you aren't losing your mind the way everyone seems to suggest. The train itself is beautiful. A restored narrow-gauge locomotive pulling 3 passenger cars on a half-mile loop that takes about 20 minutes. You run it multiple times daily during tourist season, and by February, you have the route memorized completely. Every curve, every elevation change, every historical marker. You could do it in your sleep. Most days you feel like you are doing exactly that. The passenger manifests are printed before each run. Names, number of tickets, special requests. You check them obsessively because it's the only part of the job that varies. On Thursday, February 21st, 2019, the first third Thursday of your employment, you notice something odd. The manifest lists 42 passengers for the 2 p.m. run. When you do your pre-departure count, you have 43 people in the cars. You recount. Definitely 43. You check the manifest again. Definitely 42. You ask your assistant Marcus if anyone bought a last-minute ticket without updating the system. He says no. You're meticulous about that. You shrug it off. Counting error. Mathematical slip. You'll recount before departure. When you do the final passenger check before starting the engine, you have 42. Exactly as the manifest states. You convince yourself you miscounted the first time. But you feel strange the entire run, anxious, like you've forgotten something important. When you return to the station and do the exit count, you get 41 passengers departing. 1 person is missing. You search the cars frantically, under seats, in the storage compartments, checking if anyone has fallen asleep in the back. Nothing. 41 boarded, 43 rode, 41 exited. The numbers make no sense. You review the security footage from that run obsessively that evening. The camera angle is limited, but you can see most of the interior. 42 people board. You watch them settle into seats, point at scenery, take photographs. During the run, you can count 42 heads at all times. But when passengers disembark, you only count 41 leaving the cars. 1 person simply ceases to exist between departure and arrival. You tell yourself it's a camera glitch, a blind spot you hadn't considered. You check the footage frame by frame. At no point do you see anyone exit the cars beyond the designated stop. They don't jump. They don't leave during the loop. They simply vanish. You don't mention it to anyone. You're already the quiet one, the former teacher who doesn't quite fit in with the other seasonal workers. You don't need them thinking you're seeing things. The next third Thursday comes around, March 21st. You're almost expecting it now, though you can't admit that to yourself. You check the manifest. 38 passengers. You do your count. 39 people board. Your hands are shaking as you start the engine. During the run, you count carefully, obsessively, trying to catch the moment when the extra person vanishes. You never do. They're there, then they're not. By the time you return, you count 38 disembarking. Exactly as the manifest predicted. You download the footage. You watch it 5 times. Every time you see 39 people board. Every time you see only 38 people exit. The missing passenger is visible on the first part of the loop. You can see their silhouette in the third car, their head, their shoulder against the window. Then there's a curve, the camera angle shifts slightly, and when it corrects, the seat is empty. No one has moved, no door has opened. The person is simply gone. You start making notes, dates, times, number of missing passengers. You check ticket sales records. Every third Thursday, one person boards who isn't on the manifest. Every third Thursday, one person vanishes. April 18th, you position yourself near the third car during the run. You're supposed to stay in the engine cab, but you've written a note about checking the brake system. You walk through the cars casually, trying not to draw attention. You count passengers, 19 on board. You note them mentally. You watch carefully as you approach the third car. There, row 7, a woman in a blue dress, maybe 60 years old, reading a newspaper. You make eye contact with her. She looks directly at you, and her expression is completely blank. No recognition, no acknowledgement. It's like you're transparent to her. You continue walking, your heart hammering in your chest. When you return to the third car 15 minutes later, row 7 is empty. The newspaper is still there, folded on the seat. You pick it up. The date on the masthead is March 17th, 1897. You drop the newspaper like it's burning. Your hands are shaking so badly you can barely grip the railing as you move back toward the engine car. When you complete the loop and passengers exit, you watch the woman in the blue dress leave the train. She walks down the platform, through the station, and disappears into the dust and timber structures of the ghost town. You follow her with your eyes until she's completely gone. Later, you search for records of a woman matching her description who might have died in 1897. You find nothing. You search for any deaths on the railroad in 1897. You find records of derailments, accidents, but no specific names that match. By June, you've documented 6 missing passengers. On the third Thursday of June, you do something you've been dreading. You board the train as a passenger instead of an operator, letting Marcus handle the run. You want to experience what these people experience. You want to understand. The manifest lists 41 passengers. When you board, you count 42, and you know one of them shouldn't exist. You board anyway. You take a seat in the third car and you wait. Halfway through the loop, you feel it. A chill that has nothing to do with temperature. A weight pressing against your chest like something is sitting on top of you. You look at your hands and they're slightly transparent. You can see the seat fabric through them. You look around frantically, and everyone around you is ignoring you completely. A family with 2 children doesn't even glance your way as the child reaches for the same armrest you're gripping. For about 90 seconds, though it could be longer, time feels wrong. You exist in a space between visibility and invisibility. You can see the other passengers, but they can't see you. You can see the landscape passing by, but it looks different. The buildings are newer. The trees are smaller. The railroad tracks are shinier, less weathered. You're riding a train that hasn't been built yet, or hasn't existed for 100 years, and you're the ghost on it. Then it ends. Your hands solidify. The other passengers look straight through you, and now they can see you because you're back in the present. The landscape shifts back to weathered decay and historical markers. You disembark with 41 other passengers. Marcus is waiting for you with concern on his face. He asks if you're okay. You must look terrified because he actually checks if you need water. You don't go back on the third Thursday anymore. You call in sick. You've used up your sick days, but you don't care. You've quit 3 times and returned because you need to understand. But you don't board the train anymore. You've learned what the missing passengers experience, and you don't want to experience it again. Now you just document it. You watch the manifests. You count the passengers. Every third Thursday, without fail, 1 extra person boards who shouldn't be there. 1 person vanishes between departure and return. And you know, with absolute certainty, that you're watching ghosts from 1897 riding a train that won't be rebuilt for another 90 years, trapped in a loop that repeats eternally. The train remembers them, and every third Thursday, it brings them back. What do you think those passengers are trying to do? Are they reliving their final moments or trying to escape something? Tell me in the comments. The priest's records describe Miguel Reyes as a quiet boy of 16, the son of a railroad worker who had come to Goldfield seeking steady employment. Father Ignacio of the Church at the Mount documented this testimony in June of 1895, though he did not fully comprehend what the boy was telling him. What follows is a translation of that priest's account, recorded 50 years later when Father Ignacio was dying and felt compelled to share what he had been asked to keep secret. Miguel Reyes had worked at the blacksmith shop for 8 months when he first noticed the substitution. He was meticulous in his craft. His father had taught him that precision was survival, that sloppy work got men killed in railroad gangs. Miguel approached blacksmithing with the same religious devotion. Each horseshoe was hammered into identical shape. Each nail was bent at the exact same angle. Each piece was inspected before leaving the shop. The blacksmith, a German named Otto Kessler, had promoted Miguel from water boy to junior smith, specifically because he demonstrated this obsessive attention to detail. The horseshoes Miguel forged were unremarkable, functional, well-made, indistinguishable from those crafted by any competent smith. They were sold to the miners and ranchers around Goldfield, used on their workhorses and pack animals. Miguel never thought about what happened to them after they left the shop. They were tools, objects. They had no life beyond their function. Then the miners began bringing them back, and the animals they had been nailed to had been behaving strangely. The first complaint came from a miner named Brennan. His horse had been shod with Miguel's horseshoes 2 weeks prior and had been performing well, carrying ore-laden packs down from the claim, solid and dependable. But recently the animal had become panicked, not spooked in a normal way, but driven by something that looked like compulsion. It would rear without warning, refuse to move in certain directions, and then suddenly bolt westward toward the Superstition Mountains with such force that Brennan barely managed to control it. The horse pulled toward those mountains with an intensity that suggested the animal could smell something no human could perceive. Otto Kessler examined the horseshoes. They looked perfect. He removed them, inspected them, and found nothing wrong. But when he checked Miguel's inventory of replacement horseshoes in the shop, there was a discrepancy. 3 pairs were missing from where Miguel had left them, stacked on the anvil the previous day. Miguel swore he had not taken them. He had not gone near that stack since completing his work. Otto, angry at being contradicted by his young apprentice, beat Miguel across the shoulders with a leather strap and sent him home. The boy's father would hear nothing of complaints. He was grateful Miguel had work and warned his son never to speak disrespectfully to his employer again. But Miguel knew he was telling the truth, and he knew those horseshoes had not simply disappeared. The next morning he arrived at the shop early, before Otto unlocked the doors. He did something he had never done before. He examined his own work meticulously, looking for any flaw he might have missed. Each horseshoe in his current inventory was identical to those he had made for months. Perfect, flawless, exactly as they should be. He began checking the horseshoes Otto had received back from miners, the ones that had caused problems, and that was when he understood. They were not the horseshoes he had forged. They looked identical. The same curve, the same weight distribution, the same nail holes positioned at the exact same angles. But the metal itself was different. These horseshoes had a strange quality to them, a faint luminescence when light caught them at certain angles, as if they had been forged from ore that contained something unusual. And they were warm. Genuinely warm, even though the shop was cool and they had been sitting in a pile for hours. Miguel touched one to his forehead. It burned, though not painfully. It was a heat that seemed to come from within the metal itself, radiating from something deep inside the iron. And as he held it, he felt something. A pull, a direction, an insistent tugging in the direction of the mountains. His hands were shaking when he set the horseshoe down. Over the next 2 weeks, Miguel documented what was happening. Every horseshoe he left stacked on the anvil to cool was replaced overnight with an identical version made from different metal. He never saw the substitution occur. He would leave horseshoes there at day's end, and by morning they would be transformed. The replacements would sit in the pile for a few days until miners purchased them. Then the reports would come, horses panicking, animals bolting toward the mountains, riders barely maintaining control. Miguel tried staying late to witness the substitution, but he fell asleep every time, despite his desperate determination to remain awake. It was a dreamless unconsciousness, as if something in the shop was actively preventing him from witnessing the exchange. He tried moving the horseshoes to different locations within the shop. They were always replaced. He tried locking them in a cabinet. The cabinet was open the next morning, though he alone had the key. The third time, Otto beat him for defective work. Miguel made a decision that terrified him. He took one of the replacement horseshoes, the warm ones made from impossible metal, and he brought it to Father Ignacio. The priest examined it in the candlelight of the church's back room. He held it to his forehead, much as Miguel had done, and his expression transformed into something between prayer and revulsion. Father Ignacio asked Miguel where the horseshoe came from. Miguel told him everything: the substitution, the warmth, the animal's reaction, his certainty that something was exchanging his work for something else each night. Father Ignacio placed the horseshoe on the stone table between them and crossed himself. He asked Miguel if he had ever touched the mountains directly, if he had ever walked on the slopes of the Superstition Range. Miguel said no. His father had forbidden it. The mountains were dangerous, and besides, the mines around Goldfield were sufficient. There was no reason to venture into wilderness that belonged to no one. The priest stood and walked to a cabinet filled with theological texts and historical documents. He withdrew a journal bound in leather that looked ancient. He opened it carefully and showed Miguel passages written in Spanish, accounts from Apache shamans, translated by an earlier priest who had worked with the indigenous people before the gold rush brought settlers. The passages described something living in the Superstition Mountains, something that had existed there long before Spanish conquest, long before American settlement, something that called to animals with a voice only they could hear, something that fed on the compulsion it created, the struggle between animal instinct and human control. The Apache had a name for it, though the translation was imperfect. The caller in stone, or the voice of wanting. What Miguel was experiencing, Father Ignacio explained, was evidence that this thing in the mountains was aware of him. It had marked him somehow. It was using the horseshoes as conduits, replacing his work with its own creations, versions of his craftsmanship that carried its will into the world. Every animal shod with one of those replacement horseshoes would feel its pull. Every owner would struggle to control a beast driven by something beyond rational explanation. Father Ignacio asked if Miguel wanted the horseshoe destroyed. Miguel said yes. The priest placed it in the fireplace, and they watched it burn. It did not char or break down like normal metal. Instead, it seemed to liquefy slowly, melting into a substance that glowed orange and emitted a high-frequency sound that made Miguel's teeth ache. When it was finally consumed, a residue remained, ash that seemed to move against gravity, rising toward the ceiling despite the absence of wind. Father Ignacio sprinkled holy water on the residue, and it dissipated into nothing, but the substitutions did not stop. Miguel returned to the blacksmith shop and found 3 more replacement horseshoes waiting on his anvil, despite having removed them completely the night before. Otto, not knowing what had occurred, accepted them as Miguel's work and sold them to miners within days. The boy worked at the shop for 3 more months, but he never shaped another horseshoe with full attention. He worked with half his mind, distracted and distant, waiting for the substitutions to occur, knowing they would, knowing he could not stop them. By September, the pattern had intensified. For every horseshoe Miguel forged, 2 replacements appeared. The supply doubled, then tripled. Miners complained more frequently. Horses throughout the Goldfield region were developing a reputation for unpredictability, for sudden panics directed always toward the mountains. In October, Miguel's father was killed in a railroad accident. A bridge collapsed, and workers fell. Miguel quit the blacksmith shop and left Goldfield with the little money he had saved. He was gone within a week. Father Ignacio documented that Miguel Reyes lived until 1926 in California, never returned to Arizona, and reportedly told no one about his experience except his wife, who never spoke of it publicly. He worked as a farmhand, always outdoors, always moving, never in one place long enough to establish routine or familiarity. Father Ignacio theorized that Miguel was fleeing not just from Goldfield, but from the possibility that the thing in the mountains might locate him again, that if he remained stationary, if he became part of the landscape, it would find him and mark him more completely. The priest's final notation, dated 1945, shortly before his death, states, "I have kept this account sealed because no one would believe it, and because I fear what might happen if the boy's story became known to others. But I record it now so that someone, someday, might understand what dwells in the mountains beyond Goldfield. The thing that calls, the thing that transforms, the thing that hungers for human work and human will to corrupt them into its own purposes. I pray it remains satisfied with horses and ore roads and the desperation of animals. I pray it never develops a taste for other things." Margaret Ashford arrived in Goldfield on a Tuesday in September 1893, with a camera worth more than most miners earned in a year, and the conviction that the American frontier was disappearing. At 29 years old, she was one of the few female photographers working the boomtowns, and she had learned early that people were more willing to be documented by a woman than by a man. There was something less threatening about her presence, less invasive. They relaxed into authenticity around her in ways they never would have otherwise. She'd come to Goldfield specifically because the town was experiencing explosive growth. Within 18 months of the first significant gold strike, the population had swelled from nothing to thousands. Buildings were rising at impossible speeds. There was a sense of urgency, of temporary permanence. Everyone understood that this wouldn't last forever, that boom always preceded collapse. Margaret wanted to capture that moment, the instant before the inevitable decline. The boarding house where she stayed was run by a severe woman named Clara Whitmore, who rented rooms to transient miners and business people passing through. It was unremarkable. 2 stories, plain, wooden construction, indistinguishable from dozens of other such establishments in mining towns throughout the territory. But Margaret chose it because of its location on Main Street, which provided excellent natural light and good sight lines for exterior photography. On her 3rd day in Goldfield, Margaret set up her camera on a tripod across the street from the boarding house. She wanted to capture the building as it existed in morning light, with miners moving past, with the texture of frontier life visible in the frame. She positioned the camera carefully, adjusted the lens, and loaded a photographic plate. The exposure would take several seconds, long enough to capture movement, short enough to maintain focus. When she developed the plate that evening in her makeshift darkroom at Clara's boarding house, something was wrong. The exterior of the boarding house was visible, exactly as she had framed it. The street, the adjacent buildings, the passing miners all appeared where they should. But the windows of the boarding house were not showing the exterior wall behind them, as should be the case with the angle and distance of her shot. Instead, the windows displayed interior rooms, bedrooms, a hallway, a kitchen. She could see inside the building through the exterior windows, which was optically impossible given the camera's position and angle. Margaret assumed it was an error in development, contaminated chemicals, improper exposure time, some mishap in her process. She reloaded a fresh plate and repeated the shot the next morning with meticulous attention to procedure. When she developed it, the same impossible interior imagery appeared in the windows. This time she could see more clearly. A bedroom with a bed, a wardrobe, a mirror on the wall, and, in the mirror's reflection, a face. A man's face, obscured but visible, looking directly at the camera. She checked her equipment obsessively. The lens was clean. The camera body was sound. The tripod was stable. Nothing had been misaligned or damaged. She took a third plate, being even more careful, checking every component before exposure. The result was identical. Interior rooms visible through exterior windows, the man's face now clearer in the mirror's reflection. He looked furious. Margaret did not believe in supernatural explanations. She believed in chemistry, in optics, in the mechanical reliability of photographic equipment. There was a rational cause for what was appearing on her plates. There had to be. She studied the image obsessively, using a magnifying glass to examine every detail. The man in the mirror had a distinctive scar on his left cheekbone. His expression suggested not just anger but desperation. And behind him, barely visible in the mirror's reflection of a reflection, she could see something else. A woman, also looking toward the camera, her mouth open as if screaming. Margaret made a decision that violated her professional ethics. She asked Clara Whitmore about the boarding house's history. Clara was reluctant to discuss it, but Margaret persisted gently, framing it as historical interest rather than morbid curiosity. Eventually, Clara mentioned that 3 years prior, before the gold rush had brought so many transient residents, there had been an incident. A man and woman had occupied one of the upstairs rooms. The man was known to be violent jealous. One evening, screams had come from that room. By the time Clara had gathered courage to investigate, both residents were gone. The room had been locked from the inside. There was blood on the walls, but no bodies. The case had never been solved. Margaret felt cold. She asked which room. Clara described its location, second floor, eastern side, overlooking the street. The exact room Margaret could now see in the interior reflections of her photographic plates. Over the next week, Margaret took 17 more photographs of the boarding house. Each one captured the same impossible phenomenon: interior rooms visible through exterior windows. Each image showed the man and woman more clearly as the plates accumulated. In some shots, the woman appeared to be attempting to escape. In others, she was on the ground. In the final images, she was no longer visible at all. Only the man remained, staring directly at the camera, with an expression of anguish and accusation. Margaret documented her findings meticulously. She photographed her photographic plates, creating records of the records. She wrote detailed notes about exposure times, chemical composition of her developers, ambient light conditions. She was trying to construct a logical explanation, but logic was failing her. Whatever was appearing on her plates had nothing to do with equipment malfunction or development. Error. The images were consistent. They were progressive. They were telling a story that unfolded across multiple exposures. On the 8th day of her documentation, Margaret made a discovery that shattered her remaining skepticism. In one of the photographs, partially visible through a window on the second floor, she could see a date carved into the interior wall of the room: September 14th, 1890. The date was clear and deliberate, as if someone had inscribed it in desperation. 3 years before Margaret arrived in Goldfield. The exact timeline Clara had mentioned. That evening, Margaret reviewed all her plates in sequence, arranging them chronologically by capture date. When viewed in order, they appeared to document the final moments of two people's lives, a narrative of violence and despair playing out across the photographic medium itself. The man's expression changed from anger to something approaching regret. The woman's panic evolved into resignation. The images were, Margaret realized with mounting horror, documentation of a murder that had occurred years before she even loaded her camera. She brought the plates to the territorial marshal's office the next morning. She showed them to a man named Pritchard, who examined them with skepticism that eventually transformed into genuine alarm. He interrogated Clara Whitmore about the boarding house incident. Clara repeated her story. She had never seen the residents again after that night. She had assumed they had fled. She had never reported it to authorities because such things were common in frontier towns. People disappeared, and justice was assumed but rarely proven. Pritchard took Margaret's photographic plates into evidence. He stated that they would be preserved and potentially used to identify the individuals depicted in them. Margaret never saw the plates again. When she inquired about the investigation weeks later, Pritchard told her that the case remained unsolved, but that he had contacted authorities in neighboring territories. Perhaps the couple had fled and committed similar crimes elsewhere. Perhaps they had simply vanished into the desert. But before he concluded the conversation, Pritchard asked Margaret an unsettling question. In all your photographs of that boarding house, did you ever capture an image of the building as it actually appeared, or did every plate show you something that shouldn't be visible? Margaret realized she didn't know. She had documented all the plates she had taken facing the building from across the street. But there was one plate she had never developed, the very first one, taken on her first day in Goldfield, before she knew anything about the building's history. She had assumed it was ruined, improperly exposed. She had never bothered developing it. She found it in her supplies that evening and carefully processed it in the darkroom. When the image emerged from the chemical bath, Margaret's hands began to shake. The photograph showed the boarding house exactly as it appeared to the naked eye. Plain, ordinary, unremarkable. No impossible interior reflections, no faces in windows, no documentation of violence, just an empty building waiting to be remembered. Margaret left Goldfield 3 days later. She never photographed the boarding house again, but she kept one of the documented plates, the one showing the woman's face most clearly, sealed in an envelope that she never opened. Before her death in 1927, she left instructions that the plate be destroyed, unexamined. Her wishes were honored. But in 1958, a researcher examining Margaret's photographic archives discovered a notation on an empty plate sleeve. The building doesn't want to be remembered as it is. It wants to be remembered as what happened inside it. The camera sees that. The camera always sees that. If a photograph captures something that happened in the past, is the camera documenting reality or creating it? What do you think Margaret should have done? Leave your theories in the comments. Thomas Harrow had survived the Civil War, survived Reconstruction, and survived 30 years of hard labor in mines across 3 territories. He was 38 years old when he arrived in Goldfield in January 1894, with a pronounced limp from a cavalry saber wound that had never healed quite right, and a complete absence of illusions about what life owed him. The mining company hired him immediately as a cage operator for the main shaft, a position that required steady nerve, mechanical aptitude, and indifference to danger. Thomas possessed all 3 in abundance. The cage itself was a simple mechanical system, a wooden platform suspended by steel cables, controlled by a system of pulleys and hand levers operated from a station at the shaft's mouth. The operator's job was straightforward: lower miners into the darkness at shift beginning, raise them back to surface at shift end, respond to signals from below, and maintain the equipment's mechanical integrity. Thomas was good at it. He understood machines intuitively. He understood the language of metal and tension and weight distribution. For the first 3 months, the work was uneventful. Thomas would lower the morning shift into the darkness, spend the day performing maintenance on the cage mechanism, and raise miners back to daylight when the shift horn sounded. He knew most of the men by sight. He knew which ones moved quickly and which ones were tired. He knew the sound the cables made under different loads. He knew, in the way that experienced workers know, the precise rhythm of the operation. Then, in April, he began losing time. The first instance was subtle, so subtle that Thomas might have ignored it if his mind had been less disciplined. He had lowered the morning shift at approximately 6:47 a.m. As recorded on the pocket watch he checked obsessively. He planned to perform a routine inspection of the pulley bearings, a task that typically required 40 minutes. When he checked his watch again, it was 7:34 a.m. He had lost 47 minutes without any conscious awareness of their passage. Thomas examined himself carefully. He had not struck his head. He showed no sign of physical trauma. He had not slept. He was standing upright at the machinery control station, his hands positioned exactly where they should be. But his mind contained no memory of those 47 minutes. They were simply absent, a gap in his consciousness that left no explanation. He mentioned it to no one. In mining work, any suggestion of mental instability or physical unreliability meant immediate dismissal. Thomas needed the wages. He needed the work to continue. But it happened again 3 days later. He lowered the morning shift, checked his watch, 6:49 a.m., and then checked it again to find 8:15 a.m., an hour and 26 minutes gone. This time, when he examined his hands, they were covered in grease and coal dust that suggested he had been working actively during the lost time, but he had no memory of it. Thomas began keeping detailed notes, time gaps, duration of lost time, what he found afterward, had he apparently performed maintenance, had the cage been in a particular position. He was trying to establish a pattern, though he recognized the danger in that impulse. Pattern seeking could be a symptom of the mental deterioration he was terrified of experiencing. Over 2 weeks, he documented 6 separate episodes of missing time. The gaps ranged from 30 minutes to nearly 3 hours. During each episode, it appeared that Thomas had continued working. The cage had been operated, maintenance had been performed, the system had continued functioning. But he had no conscious memory of any of it. The truly terrifying part came when other workers began confirming his fragmented memories. A miner named Corey mentioned that Thomas had raised him from the shaft at 2:15 p.m. on a specific day. Thomas checked his notes and found that his conscious memory ended at 1:47 p.m. and resumed at 2:53 p.m. According to Corey, Thomas had operated the cage competently, responded to signals correctly, and seemed perfectly normal. But Thomas had experienced none of it. He went to the company doctor, a man named Hendricks, who worked primarily on treating injuries rather than examining nervous conditions. Thomas explained that he was experiencing lapses in consciousness, moments where time seemed to skip forward. He was careful to describe it as related to his old war wound, to something potentially neurological rather than psychiatric. Hendricks examined him perfunctorily, found nothing obviously wrong, and suggested that Thomas might be working too hard. Perhaps he should take a day of rest. Thomas took the advice and spent a day away from the mine. He walked the town, ate regular meals, attempted to rest. When he returned to work the next morning, the lost time continued immediately. He lowered the morning shift and lost 42 minutes. He raised the afternoon shift and lost an hour. The pattern was accelerating. By late May, Thomas was losing 3 to 5 hours per day. He would enter a state of fugue, fully functional, continuing to operate the cage and maintain the equipment, but completely absent from his own consciousness. Other workers would address him, and he would respond appropriately, though he would have no memory of the conversation. The cage continued operating smoothly, which suggested that some part of his mind was continuing to function, to make decisions, to perform skilled labor. But it was not the part of his mind that was Thomas Harrow. He began experimenting in desperation. He tried staying awake through the night before his shift, reasoning that exhaustion might be causing the problem. The lost time intensified instead. Entire 4-hour blocks disappeared. He tried limiting his physical activity, thinking perhaps exertion was triggering something. The episodes became longer. He tried adjusting his diet, his sleep schedule, his exposure to mining chemicals. Nothing altered the pattern. The worst realization came in the middle of June. Thomas was reviewing his notes when he noticed something impossible. On June 12th, his conscious memory covered the period from 6:30 a.m. to 7:15 a.m. and then again from 4:45 p.m. to 5:20 p.m. But a miner named Patterson stated that he had been raised from the shaft at 12:30 p.m. by Thomas personally. Patterson had spoken to Thomas, asked him about a specific detail regarding tomorrow's work, and received a coherent response. Thomas had absolutely no memory of any of this, and his pocket watch, which he carried with him at all times, showed no evidence of having been checked during that period. Yet he had apparently descended into the mine shaft and operated the cage at significant depth, something he had never done during his conscious hours. That evening, Thomas made a decision that terrified him. He asked Patterson to take him into the mine. He had always operated from the surface. He had never actually descended into the darkness. Patterson was confused but obliged, and they took the cage down to the deepest active working level, approximately 800 feet below the surface. At that depth, Thomas felt something, a pressure, a presence, a gravity that had nothing to do with the physical weight of the earth above them. And he understood, with a certainty that transcended rational explanation, that something in the mine was aware of him. Something was using him. Something had been extracting portions of his consciousness and substituting them with its own will, its own purposes, its own labor. When they returned to the surface, Thomas submitted his resignation. He told the supervisor that he could no longer perform the work, that something about the deep mining was affecting his health. The supervisor was disappointed. Thomas was one of the most reliable operators they had employed, but he accepted the resignation without pressing for details. Thomas Harrow left Goldfield within a week. He moved to Phoenix, took work on the railroad, and deliberately avoided mining operations for the rest of his life. But he carried with him the certainty of what had happened, that in the depths below Goldfield, something had learned to operate human machinery as efficiently as it operated mechanical machinery. It had taken portions of his consciousness and replaced them with its own purposes, its own work. It had turned him into a tool as surely as it used the cage and cables. Decades later, when Thomas was 73 years old and living in Arizona City, a younger man asked him why he had such a pronounced aversion to deep places. Thomas replied, "Because I've been down there, and something down there still knows what I taste like. It remembers the feel of my hands operating its machinery, and if I go back, I'm not certain there will be enough of me left to return to the surface." He never explained what he meant by that statement, and he refused to elaborate when pressed. But everyone who knew him understood that Thomas Harrow had experienced something in the Goldfield mines that had fundamentally altered his understanding of consciousness, agency, and the limits of human will. If you lost hours of your life but everything continued functioning normally, would you consider yourself still yourself? What would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. Evelyn Cross had played piano in San Francisco brothels for 23 years before arriving in Goldfield in March 1895. She was 52 years old with hands that ached constantly from arthritis and a voice that had been ruined by cigarette smoke and hard liquor somewhere around the time she turned 30. She came to Goldfield not out of ambition but out of necessity. San Francisco had become too expensive, and she had heard that miners would pay well for entertainment in remote towns. The Mammoth Saloon hired her immediately, offering wages that seemed impossibly generous for what amounted to playing the same 12 songs repeatedly for drunk men. The piano itself was a beautiful instrument, a rosewood upright that had been hauled to Goldfield at considerable expense. The owner, A man named Morrison had purchased it from a music hall in Denver that was closing. It had been manufactured in 1887 in Boston, a quality instrument despite its age and the rough treatment it had endured during transportation across rough terrain. Evelyn examined it carefully when she first arrived and found it reasonably well maintained, though the tuning was disastrous and several keys stuck occasionally. She spent her first week retuning the instrument and learning the specific acoustic characteristics of the Mammoth's interior space. The saloon was a large, high-ceilinged room with wooden walls that absorbed sound unevenly, creating strange reverberations in certain frequencies. The piano sat on a small stage at one end of the room, positioned so that Evelyn could see the entire saloon while performing. It was not an ideal setup for serious musicianship, but Evelyn had abandoned any pretense toward serious musicianship decades ago. She was a technician now, someone who understood how to produce the sounds that would keep men drinking and spending money. For the first few months, everything proceeded normally. Evelyn arrived at the saloon at 8 p.m., played her repertoire until midnight, and collected her wages. The routine was monotonous but safe. She had learned in San Francisco that monotony was preferable to the alternative. Unexpected variation in saloon work usually meant violence of some kind. Then, in July, she began noticing something unusual. On certain evenings, she would arrive at the Mammoth to find the piano bench pulled away from the keyboard, the cover open, and the interior of the instrument exposed. The saloon owner insisted that the cleaning staff had not touched the piano. No one had authorization to open it. Yet there it was, mysteriously exposed, waiting for her to begin her shift. The first time it happened, Evelyn simply closed the cover and adjusted the bench, assuming some patron had been curious about the instrument's interior. But the second time, 3 days later, she felt genuine unease. She was alone in the saloon, the staff having not yet arrived. The piano stood exposed like an open mouth, and as she approached it, she felt something that she could not quite articulate, a sense of presence, as if something was waiting inside the instrument. She closed it quickly and did not investigate further. Over the course of 3 weeks, the phenomenon repeated 7 times. Each instance followed the same pattern. Evelyn would arrive to find the piano deliberately opened, the bench moved, the instrument exposed, and waiting. She never discovered who was opening it. The doors were locked during the day. The windows were secure. Yet somehow the piano was being intentionally accessed, deliberately revealed. Evelyn began arriving earlier, attempting to witness the opening. She would position herself outside the saloon beginning an hour before her shift, watching the building for any sign of intrusion. She never saw anyone enter, but when she used her key to unlock the saloon door, there the piano would be, open, exposed, waiting. It was in late August that Evelyn first heard the music. She had arrived for her shift and found the piano open as had become routine. She was about to close the cover when she heard it, faint but distinct, the sound of piano keys being depressed. A melody. A slow, mournful piece that she did not immediately recognize. She stood frozen, listening, as the music continued. It was being played from inside the piano, as if invisible fingers were striking the strings directly, without the mechanism of keys and hammers. The melody resolved to an end. The instrument fell silent. Evelyn's heart was beating so forcefully that she thought she might vomit. She closed the piano cover and did not open it again. She played her shift using only the keys, never lifting the cover, focusing on her mechanical work as a way to maintain her sanity. But when she returned the next evening, the piano was open again, and she heard the music once more, a different melody this time, equally mournful, equally impossible. This pattern continued for 3 weeks. Each evening, Evelyn would find the piano open. Each evening, if she dared to listen, she would hear music being played from within the instrument by no visible mechanism. She considered quitting. She had saved money over her years in San Francisco. She could leave, but she was 52 years old and work was increasingly difficult to find at her age. The mammoth paid well. She could tolerate impossibility if the wages were sufficient. In September, something shifted. Evelyn arrived one evening to find the piano open, and she decided, perhaps out of genuine curiosity, perhaps out of a kind of fatalistic acceptance, to actually investigate. She lifted the cover fully and examined the interior. The strings were intact. The hammers were in proper position. The action mechanism was where it should be. Everything appeared mechanically sound. Then she noticed something peculiar. Certain strings appeared to have been recently touched. There were fingerprints on them, visible dust patterns that indicated direct contact. Someone or something had been playing the strings by hand, bypassing the mechanical action entirely. The fingerprints were small, delicate, belonging to someone with narrow hands. Evelyn did not recognize the handwriting of the most recent melody, but something about it triggered a memory. She had heard these progressions before, these chord structures, this particular style of composition. It took her several minutes to place it. A piece by Chopin, one of his nocturnes, a melody that had been popular in San Francisco in the 1870s. A piece she had been taught to play as a younger woman, back when she had possessed genuine musical training. A piece that her daughter had loved, back when her daughter had still spoken to her. The realization struck Evelyn like a physical blow. She sat down hard on the piano bench and began to cry. Her daughter, the child she had abandoned in San Francisco when she was unable to afford care while working the brothels, her daughter had loved this piece, had practiced it obsessively on an inferior piano in a rented room where Evelyn paid rent but did not live. The piano fell silent after that night. The cover remained closed. The instrument no longer opened mysteriously, but the silence was somehow worse than the music had been, because it suggested that whatever had been trying to communicate with her had received its message through. Whatever presence had been occupying the piano understood that Evelyn had finally listened. In October, Evelyn gave notice. She told Morrison that she was leaving Goldfield, that she needed to return to California. Morrison seemed disappointed, but accepted her resignation without pressing for details. Evelyn collected her final wages and departed within the week. She never returned to the saloon, but before she left Goldfield, she made one final visit to the Mammoth during daylight hours when the building was closed and locked. She stood outside the windows and looked at the piano, visible on its stage in the dim interior. She stood there for almost an hour, watching the instrument as if it might somehow move, might somehow communicate one final message. It did not. The piano remained silent and still. Evelyn lived another 12 years in California, working occasionally as a piano teacher for children from middle-class families who could afford lessons. She never explained why she so frequently chose to teach the Chopin nocturnes, despite their difficulty for young students. She never spoke about Goldfield to anyone. And when someone asked her late in her life whether she believed in ghosts, she replied only, "I believe that love is patient. I believe it waits. And I believe that sometimes it finds ways to remind us of what we have lost, even when we have spent decades pretending it doesn't matter anymore." She never played piano publicly again after leaving the Mammoth Saloon. When asked why, she would simply say that she had already heard what the instrument had been trying to tell her, that there was nothing more to learn from music except regret. And regret was a song that played endlessly, whether you accompanied it on piano or not. Do you think the piano was haunted by Evelyn's daughter or by Evelyn's own guilt? Was it trying to punish or forgive? Leave your interpretation in the comments. Adelaide Thorne was 19 years old when her father decided to leave the management of the general store's accounting to her. It was 1896, and Goldfield was beginning its inevitable decline. The gold deposits that had seemed inexhaustible in 1893 were proving finite, and the miners were starting to move on to newer strikes in Nevada and California. Her father, recognizing the town's trajectory, had begun reducing his involvement in the business, focusing instead on liquidating inventory and converting goods to cash before Goldfield became completely worthless. Adelaide had been educated in Philadelphia before the family relocated to Arizona territory. She understood mathematics, bookkeeping, ledger management, and the mechanics of commercial transaction. Her father trusted her completely with the store's financial records, perhaps too completely as it would turn out. He gave her authority over purchases, inventory tracking, credit extension, and payment recording. She became, in essence, the unofficial manager of the store, though her father retained ownership and ultimate decision-making authority. The ledger itself was a substantial volume bound in leather, with pages numbered sequentially and ruled with precise lines for recording transactions. Each page represented 1 week of business. Each line represented a transaction, item purchased, quantity, price, customer name, date of payment, or extension of credit. Adelaide maintained it meticulously, recording every detail with the precision that she had been taught represented the difference between honest commerce and fraud. In October 1896, Adelaide began noticing entries in the ledger that she had not made. The first one appeared on a Thursday. She had completed the week's transactions and closed the ledger on Wednesday evening. The entries covered the entire week's business, roughly 40 transactions ranging from bulk flour purchases by the saloons to small acquisitions by individual miners. The numbers added up correctly. The customer names matched the store's regular clientele. Everything appeared legitimate and properly recorded. But on Friday morning, when Adelaide opened the ledger to begin recording the new day's transactions, she found a new entry dated for Saturday, October 10th. It was written in her handwriting, or at least handwriting so similar to hers that she could not definitively distinguish it from her own. The entry recorded a purchase of 25 pounds of flour, salt pork, coffee, and sugar. A substantial order. A legitimate transaction. But Adelaide had not made this sale. She had not recorded this entry. And Saturday had not yet occurred. She showed the entry to her father. He examined it carefully and suggested that Adelaide must have recorded it absently, perhaps having forgotten the transaction. Adelaide insisted that she had not. She was meticulous about dating transactions on the actual day they occurred, never in advance. Her father, with the vague dismissiveness of someone who did not wish to engage with the problem, suggested that Adelaide must have been mistaken about the date. Perhaps the transaction had occurred the previous Saturday, and Adelaide was simply confused about which week it belonged to. Adelaide knew this was incorrect, but she did not press the matter. Instead, she examined the entry more carefully. The customer name was James Kellerman, a man she recognized as someone who owned a claim adjacent to the richest mining areas. But Kellerman had not been in the store on Saturday. She was certain of that. She had been working the store alone that day, due to her father being ill. When Saturday arrived, Adelaide waited to see if Kellerman would arrive to purchase the items listed in the ledger. He did not appear. No transaction occurred. Yet the entry remained in the ledger, a prediction of a purchase that never happened. On Sunday, a different entry appeared. This one was dated for Monday and recorded a purchase by a man named Robert Hutchins, a surveyor who worked for several of the mining companies. Again, Adelaide had not written this entry. Again, the handwriting matched hers so closely that forgery seemed unlikely. Again, the transaction was reasonable and legitimate. When Monday arrived, Hutchins did not appear to make the purchase. Adelaide began documenting the phenomenon. She purchased a new ledger and began maintaining a parallel record, writing down only the transactions that actually occurred, with dates recorded on the day of transaction. Meanwhile, the original ledger, the one that had been her responsibility for months, continued filling itself with future entries. Entries for purchases that had not yet happened, written in handwriting indistinguishable from her own, dated for days and weeks in advance. Most disturbing was the pattern she began to observe. The entries that appeared spontaneously were being purchased by people Adelaide knew were preparing to leave Goldfield. Kellerman, Hutchins, the Brennan brothers, a woman named Margaret who ran a boarding house. All were buying supplies in quantities that suggested extended travel. All were purchasing items consistent with abandonment of permanent residence. By November, Adelaide realized that the ledger was documenting the exodus from Goldfield before it actually occurred. It was predicting departures. It was recording transactions that represented the final acquisitions of people preparing to disappear from the town. She brought the anomalous entries to her father's attention more forcefully. This time she showed him entries dated weeks in advance, purchases that had not yet occurred recorded in precise detail. Her father became genuinely disturbed. He accused Adelaide of perpetrating a fraud, of deliberately falsifying entries to cover some personal transgression. Adelaide denied this vehemently, but her father's skepticism planted doubt in her own mind. Had she somehow written these entries while in some kind of fugue state? Was she losing her grip on reality? She consulted a physician in Phoenix who examined her and found no evidence of neurological damage or mental illness. He suggested that perhaps the stress of managing the store during the town's decline was affecting her stability. He recommended rest and reduction of her responsibilities. Adelaide returned to Goldfield and asked her father to hire someone else to manage the ledger. Her father, now convinced that Adelaide was becoming unstable, agreed to reduce her involvement, but did not replace her with another employee. Instead, he began handling the ledger himself, only to discover within 2 weeks that the entries were still appearing without his knowledge, still written in handwriting that matched whomever had most recently maintained the book, still predicting transactions that had not yet occurred. Her father became frightened. He stopped maintaining the ledger entirely, locking it in a cabinet and refusing to open it. But when Adelaide finally convinced him to examine it weeks later, they discovered that the entries had continued anyway. The locked cabinet had not prevented the ledger from filling itself with future transactions. In December, Adelaide made a discovery that transformed her understanding of the phenomenon. She opened the ledger to find an entry dated for December 25th, Christmas Day, that recorded her own family's final purchases. The entry documented the acquisition of traveling supplies, dried goods, writing materials, and a quantity of cash withdrawal. It was written in her handwriting. It was dated for 10 days in the future. Adelaide showed this entry to her father without speaking. He read it in silence. His face went pale. He looked at Adelaide and said only, "We need to leave, now, before that date arrives." They left Goldfield 3 days later, taking very little with them except the cash that had been documented in the ledger's prediction. They did not follow the exact list of supplies that the ledger had predicted, attempting to deviate from its prescriptive narrative. But they purchased roughly the same quantities of the same goods. They purchased tickets to California via the same route the ledger had apparently specified. They became, in essence, enacting the transaction that the ledger had predicted weeks before they consciously decided to leave. Adelaide never returned to Goldfield. She never saw the general store again, but she kept the ledger, locked away in a chest that she carried with her, through 3 subsequent moves across California. Before her death in 1941, she left instructions that the ledger be destroyed unopened. Her family honored this wish, burning it without examining its contents. But Adelaide's daughter, in an interview conducted in 1952 when she was elderly herself, recalled her mother mentioning one final observation about the ledger. It wasn't predicting what would happen. It was deciding what would happen. The ledger didn't record our decisions. It made our decisions for us. We thought we were choosing when to leave, but the ledger had already written our departure. We simply followed the script it had written. Adelaide's daughter was asked if she believed the ledger had been genuinely supernatural, or if it had been her mother's imagination manifesting in paranoid ways. She refused to answer directly. Instead, she said, "My mother was the most precise, rational person I ever knew. She could not have imagined something so consistently detailed, but I also know that sometimes the most rational people are the most vulnerable to encountering things that cannot be explained rationally. Perhaps that was my mother's tragedy, that she was too honest a witness to deny what she had seen, but too rational to accept it as real. If a ledger predicted your future with absolute accuracy, would you try to change it, or would you resign yourself to following the script? What would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments." Reverend James Mitchell was 41 years old when he accepted the position of weekend chaplain at the church at the Mount in Goldfield. He was a Baptist minister from Mesa who had spent 15 years in institutional ministry, working with hospitals and prisons, places where faith was tested by proximity to suffering. The Goldfield Church was a small assignment, a frontier congregation that numbered perhaps 50 regular attendees, with services held on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings. Mitchell had taken the position partly for the modest stipend, and partly because he found himself increasingly drawn to the remnants of the Old West, to places where history had calcified into landscape. The church at the Mount itself was a modest wooden structure built in 1894, on a small rise overlooking Goldfield's Main Street. It had a simple interior, wooden pews, a small altar, a lectern carved from mesquite wood. Behind the main sanctuary was a fellowship hall used for community gatherings, church socials, and potluck dinners. It was in this hall that Reverend Mitchell first encountered the impossibility that would shake the foundations of his theological certainty. The December service in 2016 was scheduled to be particularly well attended. There was talk of the church potentially closing. Attendance had declined dramatically over the years, and the quarterly maintenance costs were becoming unsustainable. This particular service was meant to rally the congregation, to remind people why the church mattered to the community. A guest speaker, a regional Baptist authority on church preservation, was scheduled to deliver an address in the fellowship hall following the main service. Mitchell arrived early on Sunday morning to prepare. He unlocked the fellowship hall and began setting up chairs for the anticipated overflow crowd. He arranged them in rows facing the lectern, counting as he worked. He had been told to expect perhaps 75 people, including the regular congregation, several visitors from Mesa, and the guest speaker's entourage. By the time the main service concluded and attendees began filtering into the fellowship hall, Mitchell had set up exactly 80 chairs. He took a position near the entrance to count people as they entered. He was meticulous about such details. He believed that precision in small matters reflected respect for larger spiritual purposes. 63 people entered the hall. Mitchell counted each one carefully. 63. The expected attendance had been 75, but it was a cold December morning, and some people had likely decided to stay home. He was satisfied with the turnout. He directed people to seats and prepared to introduce the guest speaker. Then he noticed something unusual. There were people seated in the hall that he had not seen enter. At first, Mitchell assumed he had miscounted. He stood and performed a recount, moving systematically through the rows. 78 people were seated. Definitely 78. He counted a third time to be certain. 78. Yet only 63 had entered through the door where he had been positioned. Mitchell's first instinct was to assume error on his part. Perhaps some people had entered while he was arranging chairs or speaking with someone. Perhaps he had been distracted. He made a mental note of the discrepancy and proceeded with introducing the guest speaker. The service proceeded without incident. The speaker delivered his remarks about church preservation initiatives. The congregation listened attentively. When the service concluded and people began departing, Mitchell conducted another count. 63 people exited. He watched each one leave. 63. which meant that 15 people who had been seated in the fellowship hall had simply ceased to exist. He checked the hall after everyone had departed. No one was hiding in corners. No one had remained behind. The hall was empty except for the arranged chairs. Mitchell sat down, his heart racing, attempting to process what he had witnessed. The logical explanation was that he had miscounted during the service. That was the only rational possibility. He had counted 63 entering, 78 seated, and 63 exiting. The mathematical discrepancy could only be explained by human error in his counting. But Mitchell was meticulous. He had been a hospital chaplain for years. He understood the importance of accurate record-keeping, of attention to detail. He did not make casual counting errors. Mitchell began researching the history of the church at the Mount. He discovered that the church had stood for over a century. It had been built in 1894, just as the mining boom was reaching its peak. The original congregation had been substantial: miners, merchants, the families of prominent business people. But the church's records were incomplete. Entire years of attendance logs were missing. He found scattered documents mentioning services conducted, but no comprehensive record of who had attended them. The following Sunday, Mitchell conducted his own experiment. He asked one of the regular attendees, a woman named Dorothy, who had been coming to the church for 40 years, to help him count people entering the fellowship hall. They stationed themselves at the entrance and counted together. Dorothy counted 65 people entering. Mitchell counted 65 as well. When they counted people seated in the hall, they arrived at 73. They exchanged worried glances but said nothing to anyone. When people departed, they counted 65, exiting. After the service, Dorothy pulled Mitchell aside. She said quietly, "This has happened before. I've noticed it for years, but I never said anything because I thought I was imagining it. But you saw it too, didn't you?" Mitchell admitted that he had. Dorothy continued, "There are always extra people, not many. Never enough to be obvious. But they're there, sitting in the pews, listening to the service, and then they're gone. I've always assumed they were members who had passed on coming back for services. I thought it was comforting, in a way, like they hadn't really left the congregation." Over the next several weeks, Mitchell conducted careful observations. Each service seemed to attract approximately 8 to 15 additional people, beyond those who physically entered the building. These people, if they could be called that, were indistinguishable from living congregation members. They sat quietly. They listened to sermons. Some appeared to take notes. Some appeared to pray. But when it came time to exit, they simply vanished. Mitchell attempted to speak to some of the extra attendees during services. When he approached them, they would turn to look at him, but they would not respond to his greetings. It was as if they could see him but could not hear him, or could hear him but could not speak in return. Their faces, when Mitchell looked closely, seemed oddly transparent, not ghostly or obviously supernatural, but as if they were composed of slightly less substantial material than the living congregation members. In late December, Mitchell took the extraordinary step of examining the church's oldest records, documents stored in the basement that had not been reviewed in decades. He found a journal kept by the church's founding pastor, Reverend Samuel Whitmore, dating to 1894. In the journal, Whitmore had made notes about attendance and spiritual matters. One entry, dated December 15, 1894, caught Mitchell's attention. A peculiar phenomenon has begun manifesting during services. Persons appear in the fellowship hall who were not observed entering. Some of these individuals appear to be former members who have passed into eternity. I have concluded that the church at the Mount exists in a state of spiritual intersection, a place where the boundary between the living congregation and the communion of saints is permeable. I have chosen to interpret this as evidence of God's grace, that those who have departed are permitted to continue participating in worship, to maintain connection with their faith community. I have recorded their presence as a sign of blessing rather than as cause for alarm. Mitchell sat with this journal for hours, attempting to reconcile what he was reading with his theological training. In Baptist theology, there was no concept of spirits returning to earth to participate in services. The doctrine was clear. After death, individuals proceeded to judgment. They did not linger in earthly places. They did not manifest in fellowship halls during Sunday services. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The church had been experiencing this phenomenon for over a century. Multiple people had witnessed it. Multiple people had chosen to interpret it as spiritual rather than supernatural, as the presence of beloved community members who had passed on. In January 2017, Mitchell submitted his resignation as weekend chaplain. He cited personal reasons and did not elaborate. He wrote a letter to the church's governing board recommending that they maintain the fellowship hall as a space of sacred mystery, that they continue welcoming attendees regardless of their apparent substantiality, and that they never attempt to prevent the invisible congregation from participating in services. He never returned to the church at the Mount. But shortly before his death in 2021, Mitchell gave an interview to a religious studies researcher. He was asked whether he believed the church was genuinely haunted or whether the phenomenon had psychological explanations. Mitchell replied, "I no longer distinguish between genuinely haunted and psychological in the way that dichotomy implies. If consciousness persists after death in any form, if awareness, intention, and connection to community can manifest through means we don't yet understand, then what difference does it make whether we call that haunting or grace?" The church had become a sanctuary for those who could not let go of it, and I came to believe that preventing them from participating in worship would have been more cruel than acknowledging their presence. When asked if the extra attendees bothered him, Mitchell smiled sadly and said, "Not them. What bothered me was realizing that I had been trained to deny evidence of what I was witnessing, that my theology was so rigid that it could not accommodate mystery, that 15 people were sitting beside living congregation members week after week, and most of the living never even noticed they were there. Do you think those extra attendees were genuinely the spirits of former congregation members, or were they manifestations of the church's own spiritual energy? What would you have done in Mitchell's position? Leave your interpretation in the comments." Maylin had been working as a laundry service for the Goldfield Bordello for 11 months when she began noticing that the roses were growing in the wrong places. She was 33 years old, a Chinese immigrant who had come to Arizona territory following the death of her husband in a railroad accident. She spoke limited English and maintained minimal interaction with the town's white population, which suited her perfectly. She wanted no attention, no complications, no reasons for authorities to question her right to remain in Goldfield. The laundry work was straightforward. She collected soiled linens from the bordello 3 times weekly, washed them in boiling water with harsh soap, and returned them clean and dried. The work was physically demanding and poorly paid, but it was consistent. The bordello's proprietor, a woman named Helen Garrett, was relatively fair. She did not cheat May Lin on wages, and she did not make the kind of crude advances that some white men attempted. It was, for May Lin, acceptable employment in an unacceptable situation. The bordello occupied a substantial building on the eastern edge of Goldfield's main commercial district. Behind it was a small courtyard where Helen Garrett had attempted to create a garden, an attempt at gentility in a place that existed entirely outside polite society. She had planted roses, despite the desert climate's general hostility to such delicate cultivation. The roses had struggled initially, but had begun to flourish by summer, producing blooms in shades of red and pink that seemed almost violently vivid against the surrounding brown landscape. It was while hanging linens to dry in this courtyard that Maylene first observed the peculiarity. New roses were blooming in locations where no roses had been planted. A magnificent red bloom had appeared in the corner of the courtyard where only dirt and stones existed. Another rose had materialized against the eastern wall, in a space where Mei Lin was certain no garden bed had been prepared. Over the course of 2 weeks, 7 additional roses appeared in seemingly random locations throughout the courtyard, not growing from soil, but manifesting as if they had always existed there. Mei Lin mentioned this to Helen Garrett. Helen examined the unexpected blooms and seemed momentarily confused, then dismissed them as saplings or runners that had grown from the original garden and had simply surprised her with their emergence. Helen suggested that Mei Lin not concern herself with the garden. It was not part of her responsibilities. But Mei Lin could not stop observing. She was a woman trained by circumstance to notice details, to track patterns, to remain alert to the small changes that might indicate danger or opportunity. The roses continued appearing at a rate of 3 to 4 new blooms per week. They were always healthy, always perfect, always positioned in different locations throughout the courtyard. More disturbingly, Mei Lin began to notice that the locations where the roses appeared corresponded to specific spots in the courtyard, where the ground seemed subtly disturbed, not obviously excavated but marked with a faint depression, as if something beneath the surface was pushing upward. She began documenting the locations in her mind, mapping out the courtyard in her memory, with the precision of someone who had learned that observation was survival. By October 1895, there were 32 roses growing in the courtyard, far too many for the size of the space and the quantity of plants that had been originally installed. Mei Lin began asking discreetly among the other service workers if they had noticed anything unusual. A woman who delivered supplies mentioned that Helen had commented about the mysterious roses, but seemed less bothered by them than bemused. A man who maintained the building's structure had noticed nothing unusual at all. Then in November, one of the roses died. It simply wilted overnight. The bloom blackened. The stem became brittle. The entire plant crumbled to dust when Helen brushed against it. Within 3 days, 4 more roses had died in the same manner. Within a week, more than half the mysterious roses had perished, leaving only a handful of the original garden's cultivated plants and approximately a dozen of the mysterious blooms. Mei Lin was hanging linens in the courtyard when Helen approached her. Helen was a pragmatic woman, but there was something unsettled in her expression. She asked Mei Lin if she would do additional work: maintenance of the courtyard, removal of the dead roses, general tidying of the space. Helen would pay extra wages. Mei Lin accepted immediately. Extra wages meant accelerated savings, which meant accelerated possibility of establishing independent life. As Mei Lin began clearing away the dead roses, she made discoveries that transformed her understanding of what was occurring. Beneath where the roses had been growing, the soil was disturbed. When she carefully excavated the area, she found bones. Small bones, delicate finger bones arranged deliberately in shallow graves. Beneath one particularly large rose, she found a skull. Small, belonging to someone young, with a neat fracture on the left temple. Mei Lin understood immediately. The roses were growing from graves. The mysterious blooms were marking burial sites. She stopped her excavation and covered the ground carefully, leaving everything as she had found it. She did not report her discovery to Helen. She did not inform authorities. She understood with the clarity of someone educated by displacement and marginalization that investigation would only bring complications that would end with her deportation or worse. Instead, she continued working in the courtyard, and she began mapping the locations of every mysterious rose with obsessive precision. She correlated the locations of buried remains with dates, attempting to establish a chronology. She counted the graves. There were 32 in total, corresponding exactly to the 32 roses that had appeared. Mei Lin began researching the bordello's history. She asked carefully neutral questions of Helen Garrett. How long had the bordello been operating? How many women had worked there? Did any ever leave suddenly or without warning? Helen answered vaguely, noting that women came and went frequently in such establishments. The transitions were normal and unremarkable. But Mei Lin found records. Local newspapers archived in the territorial office in Mesa contained occasional references to the bordello. There were mentions of women who had died, generally listed as outcomes of disease or accidents, nothing scandalous or unusual. But the timing of deaths corresponded with the locations of the mysterious roses. Women who had disappeared from the bordello's roster corresponded with grave locations in the courtyard. By December 1895, Mei Lin had established a pattern. The bordello had been operating since 1890. Over the course of 5 years, 32 women had disappeared or died under circumstances that had never been properly investigated. And in the autumn of 1895, precisely when the mysterious roses had begun appearing, a transition seemed to have occurred. The deaths ceased. The women who were currently working in the bordello seemed safe, at least for the moment. Mei Lin understood what this meant. Something had changed. Some force that had been claiming the lives of women in the bordello had reached a satiation point. 32 women, 32 roses. The debt had been paid, the hunger temporarily sated. She began her departure preparations immediately. She saved aggressively, reducing her expenses to nothing, working additional hours when available. She spoke to no one about what she had discovered. She maintained her daily routine of laundering linens, entering the courtyard, moving among the roses that marked graves, and revealing nothing on her face or in her demeanor. In February 1896, Mei Lin informed Helen Garrett that she was leaving Goldfield. Helen seemed disappointed, but did not attempt to convince her to stay. Mei Lin collected her final wages and departed within a week, traveling by railway to California, where she had heard there were larger Chinese communities and less rigid social structures that might allow her greater anonymity and safety. She never spoke about what she had discovered. She lived another 30 years in California, working in various positions, saving money, and eventually establishing a small boarding house for Chinese workers. She never married again. She never spoke about Goldfield. When her granddaughter asked her late in life whether she believed in ghosts, Mei Lin replied in careful English, "I believe in what the earth remembers. I believe places hold memory. I believe some deaths are not forgotten because they are never properly mourned." The roses were memory. The roses were the earth saying, "These women existed. These women mattered. Someone should know." She died in 1926, taking with her the complete knowledge of what had occurred in the bordello's courtyard. But in 1998, when the Goldfield Ghost Town underwent historical documentation, researchers discovered old photographs and newspaper records suggesting that women had disappeared from the bordello during the 1890s at an unusual rate. No cause was ever definitively established. And in the courtyard behind where the bordello had stood, now an empty space in the historical site, roses continue to bloom seasonally in patterns that do not correspond to any intentional landscaping. Visitors often remark on how beautiful they are, how they seem to appear almost randomly, how they die and regenerate with unusual frequency. No one has ever documented what lies beneath them. Do you think the roses are a natural phenomenon, a haunting, or something trying to bear witness to forgotten deaths? What would you do with Mei Lin's knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments. Derek Walters was 28 years old and possessed the particular obsession of someone who had discovered a niche passion that justified endless technical investment. He was a sound engineer specializing in ambient audio recording, and he had been hired by a documentary production company to capture the acoustic environment of Goldfield Ghost Town. The project was simple enough. Record natural sounds, wind patterns, structural resonances, and environmental audio that could serve as atmospheric backdrop for historical narration. Derek had arrived in March 2023 with professional-grade recording equipment worth approximately $15,000 and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that characterized people who spent their days analyzing sound frequencies. The elevated metal water tank that stood near the center of Goldfield's reconstructed historic district had caught Derek's attention immediately. It was a substantial structure, approximately 30 feet tall, constructed from riveted steel sheets, weathered but still structurally sound. The tank had been built in the 1890s and had survived over a century of Arizona heat cycles, rust corrosion, and environmental stress. From an acoustic perspective, it was a remarkable artifact, a massive percussion instrument waiting to be struck by wind, temperature changes, and vibration. Derek positioned his primary microphone array near the base of the tank and ran secondary microphones up the structure's support legs. He calibrated his equipment meticulously, checked levels repeatedly, and waited for wind conditions that would generate interesting acoustic phenomena. March in Arizona territory was ideal, predictable afternoon thermal winds that would create consistent sound generation opportunities. On the third day of recording, something unusual appeared in his audio files. Derek was reviewing raw recordings, categorizing them by wind velocity and directional source, when he noticed something in a file marked 3:47 p.m., March 14th. Moderate westerly wind, 12 elm. Beneath the expected metallic resonance of wind vibrating the tank's steel, there was something else. A voice, faint, but definitely present. Multiple voices, in fact, overlapping, speaking simultaneously, creating a layered acoustic texture that should not have been possible, given the environmental conditions. Derek isolated the audio frequency, amplified it, and listened carefully. The voices were speaking. Not singing, not humming, but clearly articulating words in English. He could not quite make out complete sentences, but the cadence was definitely linguistic. The acoustic quality suggested recording equipment from an earlier era. The voices had the compressed, thin quality of early 20th century phonographic recording. Derek ran spectral analysis on the audio. The frequency pattern indicated voices, specifically human vocal patterns. The acoustic properties suggested the sounds had been recorded at distance and then somehow preserved within the metal structure of the tank. When Derek examined the environmental conditions more carefully, he noticed that the voices appeared specifically when wind velocity reached between 11 and 14 miles per hour and came from a westerly direction, a specific reproducible set of conditions. He returned to the tank with fresh equipment and waited for wind conditions to match the parameters. At 3:52 p.m., when the westerly wind reached 12 hour, the voices returned. This time, Derek was prepared to record them at maximum clarity. He captured approximately 3 minutes of audio before the wind conditions shifted and the voices faded. When he processed the recording in his laptop's audio workstation, Derek was able to isolate individual voices. The audio quality remained poor, but with noise reduction and frequency isolation, he could begin to make out words. A man's voice, speaking with the accent and cadence of early 20th century American speech. The claim is solid, I'm telling you. The assay came back at 147 grains per ton. Another voice, female, overlapping. And when they find out what you've done, a third voice. Won't be found until spring, if then. Derek felt genuinely unsettled. He had recorded something that should not exist. Voices apparently preserved within the acoustic properties of a metal structure. Voices that corresponded to no current activity. Voices that sounded like historical recordings, somehow trapped in the tank's steel. He began conducting systematic research. He examined the tank's construction records and discovered it had been built in 1895 specifically to provide water storage for Goldfield's mining operations. It had operated continuously through the town's boom period and had been preserved when the town was abandoned. Records indicated that the tank had been used for various purposes throughout its history. Water storage, certainly, but also as a gathering point for town meetings and community announcements. The tank's acoustic properties meant that sound traveled to it from considerable distance and could be amplified through the hollow interior. Derek began recording at different times and wind conditions, attempting to isolate more voices. Over the course of 2 weeks, he captured hundreds of individual voice segments. Some were barely audible, some were relatively clear. Collectively, they appeared to constitute a kind of acoustic record, fragmented conversations, arguments, confessions, and recollections from the town's history. Most chillingly, Derek began to notice chronological progression. The voices seemed to be organized by date, or at least by temporal sequence. Early voices discussed the initial discovery of gold deposits. Later voices discussed claim disputes and financial disagreements. The most recent voices he could isolate discussed departures and abandonments, and running through all of them was a pattern of violence, theft, and betrayal. Derek processed the audio through spectral analysis software designed to identify speaker characteristics and patterns. He discovered that certain voices appeared repeatedly across different time periods, voices that seemed to span decades. A man's voice that appeared in conversations about the initial strikes in 1893 reappeared in conversations about claim disputes in 1895, and again in conversations about town abandonment in 1897. The same voice apparently preserved across years of acoustic phenomena. He began attempting to transcribe complete conversations. One particularly clear recording, captured on March 23rd under specific wind conditions, contained the following exchange. Male voice, 1. The scales showed 147 grains. Male voice, 2. Scales can be read wrong. Male voice, 1. You did it. You took his claim. Male voice, 2. He won't be needing it anymore. Sound of impact. Brief silence. Male voice, 1. God forgive us. Derek ran this audio through voice recognition software and cross-referenced it with documentation about Goldfield's history. He found records indicating that a claim dispute in April 1894 had resulted in a miner's death under mysterious circumstances. The names matched the patterns Derek had been documenting. Over the course of March and April, Derek isolated and transcribed approximately 40 separate conversations. They appeared to constitute a complete historical record of Goldfield's development and decline, from the discovery of the initial gold deposits through the subsequent violence, betrayal, and eventual abandonment. The water tank had apparently been recording, or somehow preserving, the significant conversations that had occurred within its acoustic range throughout the town's existence. Derek submitted his preliminary findings to the documentary production company. He included audio samples, spectral analysis, and transcriptions of the conversations he had isolated. The company's response was cautious. They suggested that Derek might be experiencing auditory pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns in random sounds, similar to seeing faces in clouds or hearing messages in static. They suggested that the voices he was hearing were psychological projections rather than genuine acoustic phenomena. Derek was certain they were wrong. The voices were too consistent, too contextually appropriate, too historically accurate to be imaginary. He continued recording throughout April and May, building an increasingly comprehensive archive of the acoustic phenomena. Then, on May 15th, something new happened. Derek was recording during afternoon wind conditions when he heard a voice he recognized, his own voice, speaking words he had not spoken. In the audio file, Derek's voice was saying, "I've heard everything. I know what happened. I'm going to tell someone." The voice sounded frightened. The acoustic qualities suggested it was being captured in real time rather than being a historical preservation. Derek's hands began shaking. He checked his recording equipment. Nothing was wrong. He checked the file metadata. It was definitely recorded in real time during the current session. He had somehow just captured himself, or rather a version of himself, articulating something he was currently experiencing. He stopped recording immediately and did not return to the tank for 3 days. When he finally approached it again, he positioned his microphones with extreme caution. He set them to record only and did not monitor the audio in real time. He let them run for 6 hours, while wind conditions changed throughout the afternoon. When he reviewed the recordings that evening, he found something new. In the evening recording at approximately 6:47 p.m., he heard a woman's voice. A voice he did not recognize, but which sounded strangely familiar. The voice was saying, "The tank remembers everything. It never forgets. And soon it will remember you too. Soon your voice will be here with all the others, repeating forever, telling your story to anyone who knows how to listen." Derek packed his equipment and left Goldfield the following morning. He submitted his recordings and analysis to the documentary company with a recommendation that they not pursue further investigation of the acoustic phenomena. The company ultimately decided not to include the water tank audio in their final documentary, citing unclear source origin and potential equipment malfunction. Derek has not returned to Goldfield. He continues working as a sound engineer, but has deliberately avoided all projects related to ghost towns or historical sites. When colleagues ask why he refuses certain opportunities, he simply states that he has a personal policy against recording in locations with complex acoustic histories. But he keeps all his Goldfield recordings backed up on an isolated drive. And sometimes, late at night, he listens to them again, particularly the segment where his own voice articulates fears he was experiencing in that moment. He has never been able to determine how the tank captured his voice before he spoke it. He has never attempted to understand the mechanics of what was occurring. Some phenomena, Derek has concluded, are not meant to be understood. They are only meant to be documented and witnessed. The water tank is still standing in Goldfield. The afternoon winds still pass through it. And somewhere in the metal, voices continue to accumulate, conversations being preserved in acoustic form, waiting for someone with the right equipment and the willingness to listen to remember what the town has been trying to reveal. If you could hear every conversation that ever happened in a place, would you want to? Would you be able to handle what you discovered? Join Verified Souls and explore the stories that locations refuse to forget. Subscribe and share your own theories in the comments. What do you think the water tank is trying to tell us?